Welcome, everyone. My name is Thane Rosenbaum. I'm the creative director of the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society at Touro University. And welcome to the FOLCS headline series. Tonight, hijab revolt in Iran. Everyone, certainly that's tuned in tonight, knows that Iran is into its third month of what we can clearly describe as a revolution. A Kurdish woman, Mahsa Amini, and her brother, who are from a Kurdish area of Iran, traveled to Tehran, and it was there that she was both hassled and arrested by the morality police and their enforcement of strict Muslim clerics' headscarves regulations, which essentially, in her case, which I didn't even realize until the other day from our special guest, it wasn't so much that she was some of her hair was showing. It was that some of the buttons on her scarf were undone. It wasn't even that she was showing hair, but she ended up getting beaten to death. She was in a hospital with a cracked skull. The Iranian government reported that she died of cardiac arrest. Almost instantly, Persian Iranian women took to the streets. This for them was the last straw. And an entire movement has been galvanized, in many ways reminiscent of what we saw with Arab Spring and when the Tunisian vendor set himself aflame. The women of Iran have taken over, and this is now their revolution, and they are joined by hundreds of thousands of others. We have a special guest to discuss this, my longtime friend, Roya Hakakian. Roya is many things. There she is. Hi, Roya. Welcome.
Hi.
Welcome to folks.
Thank
Roya
you.
is so many things. She's a poet. She's a journalist. She's an essayist. She's clearly, if you've been following her lately, a human rights crusader and activist. In my mind, she's clearly one of the intellectual faces, minds, and voices of this movement, certainly based here in the United States. And you don't have to just take my word for it. Yes, she's my friend, and of course I would boast about her, but she's testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and she's had special meetings with Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. She's clearly a voice and an opinion that everyone is asking and how to understand Iran during these days. She published in Atlantic magazine, and I commend you to get the link to Roya Hakakian's essay, Bonfire of the Headscarves. In my mind, it'll be an award-winning essay by the time this year is over. It is really singular, important. The voice is clear, and the moral courage and the moral integrity is so apparent in every sentence. She's also the author of several books. Journey from the Land of No is my favorite, but they all deal in very much as an Iranian and as also a woman and as an immigrant. If you're watching us live on YouTube, welcome. Thanks for watching our channel. Please go to folks.org and sign up for our email list as well, so you'll get notice of future events. And if you have a question, the headline series is enormously popular when it comes to questions from the audience. So if you have a question for Roya, go to the Q&A box and leave it there. Roya, let's start with, you could be Mahsa, right? This story could have been your story if not for the grace of Allah or for the grace of Adonai in your case. You could have gone, right? Could you just briefly tell the audience that you too were a young woman during the early days of the Islamic Revolution?
I was a young woman during the early days of the Islamic Revolution. And in fact, the final chapter of my memoir, to which you just referred, is called 1984. And that's the year I was in my last year of high school. And it had been about 3 years that the mandatory dress code had become law in Iran. And so it was an August day. I was walking in Tehran. It was the month of Ramadan. So water fountains had been shut down and restaurants were closed and there was not a drop of water to be had. So under the blistering sun, I was covered in a scarf, the Islamic uniform, which was supposed to be a baggy and raincoat-like thing that covered you up, didn't allow any of your curves to show, and then a pair of pants and closed-toed shoes, and I was sweating, and I don't know at what point I stopped sweating because it was hot, and started sweating because I felt such wrath, such bottomless wrath. And for a moment, I looked at the sky and I thought, I don't care if somebody bombs us and I die, as long as those people who impose this on me go too. And it's amazing that of all the things that I lived through in Iran, one of the most memorable times, one of the most memorable events is just this walk under the sun on that day in August.
I remember that part of the memoir and how it ends on that, and it is very striking to think about. I remember you just reminded me. What I remember is how when we're young, we're always told that younger people have less impulse control, and they can be more reckless. And I thought, yeah, a young woman would think that in a way that 15 years later you might have thought it, that the sense of what you said, wrath, or I might describe as just outrage. Like, are you kidding me? Really? I have to wear this? Speaking of wearing this, something you said recently that I found interesting is that, the regime has said that the hijab there's a long Iranian tradition of the hijab. And you said this is just nonsense. Like, they make this stuff up. And maybe it's important to explain, because that seems to be part of the justification that we are returning to a tradition that women accepted willingly. And so that's not in fact true, right?
Well, no, the tradition, as far as my own observation and upbringings are concerned, was for people to have choice. So it was very normal to walk on the streets of Tehran, prior to 1979, and, for one woman to wear the hijab, in fact, the black veil, and another one walk by in a mini skirt. And that was normal. That was, in fact, tradition. The tradition was that live and let live. And I think that had been a very important moment for the, Iranian culture to arrive at, to the moment where you realize that the society included these desires on both parts, on the part of women who wanted to cover up and others who didn't. And so I was shocked when I came to the United States. I was sitting in my first college class, which was a psychology class, and the professor started talking about relativism and how different cultures, think about the same subject differently. And then suddenly he said, for instance, the people of Iran embrace the hijab because it's their tradition. And I'm sitting in the back of the class thinking, what?
What Iran are you talking about?
I just ran away from all that. So I think, if I may fast forward this conversation just a bit, I think one of the very important things that this movement has achieved already is to relay to the world that this is not tradition, and it is not the way religion ought to be exercised.
So the movement has now taken a life of its own, to the extent to which, if I asked you this, if the regime said tomorrow, the ayatollahs, the mullahs, the imams all showed up and said, you know what, we've given this some thought and we've decided, you know what, the headscarves is not that important to us. Everything else is really important to us. Let the hair flow, let it flow. And can we be done with this revolution? Would this go away? Would the men say to the women, all right, before you get your head clubbed in, let's end it, call it a draw, we win? What would happen at this point?
Nothing would change. Nobody would go home. Nothing would change. And somebody, I'm sure, in Tehran is sitting in some office or some high officialdom residence kicking himself. And if he's not, he should be. Because if they had done that in 2009,
yeah,
they could have bought themselves perhaps another 20 years.
Yeah.
Because in 2009, during the Green
Revolution
movement,
yeah.
People were still in conversation with the regime. They
Right.
were still saying, where is my vote? Which meant, you still have some legitimacy. So we think that if we ask you to look into the rigged elections, you will do the right thing. There was a conversation. The problem now is that there is no more conversation. And so however the regime decides to relent now, it's too late.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I mean, the last time I saw little girls and boys rip up the images of Iran's leadership from their textbooks was 1978. So these are scenes that Iran hasn't seen in 44 years. And
Wow.
That's why I think we can't go back.
So, but is it because the people do no longer trust these leaders and these clerics, and nothing they say, period, nothing they say would be legitimate? Or is it that the clerics is saying, we are so stubborn and we are so indignant that this is the way it must be, that we will not capitulate to them no matter what they do? Are we talking about two forces that will never, ever reach any reconciliation? They hate each other that much.
Okay, so here's something that I read when I was a teenager, from my most favorite poet in Iran, who was called Ahmad Shamlou. And the line is this from the poem I really adored. The line said, I am not your enemy, I am your denier. So it means that at some point I've decided that you're too small for me to call you my enemy.
Wow.
I have surpassed you and
Terrific.
have gone somewhere else. So we could say that they hate each other, but I'd like to think that at this particular moment, the nation has reached a sense of democratic maturity that they have actually surpassed the regime. That is why I think, when they go to the street and they say death to the dictator, and they're no longer saying or taking the positions that the nation took in 1978. Because remember, in 1978, you had the religious conservatives on the right, and you had the Marxists and the leftists on the left. And so there were two political campaigns that were operating in parallel. And then they coincided at some points in order to overthrow the monarchy. But in general, they had been operating in a parallel fashion. What has happened now is that there are no signs of a political campaign, of a political agenda for an ideology. It is the most basic desire for democracy, which is all about living a normal life. And that's why I think to define it by animosity would be to reduce it to what it is, to less than what it is.
Great
what
answer.
It is that it's completely gone beyond the clerics. It's way above. And I just wrote a piece which will appear in the Atlantic within a day or so, in which I begin by saying, if George Washington were to pick two nations today who are living up to his most important ideals, they wouldn't necessarily be the people of America, but they would certainly be the people of Iran and Ukraine.
Wow. I can't wait for for the link to that Atlantic essay. Briefly, given what you just said, the country is fairly united. We're talking about a country with lots of ethnic strife and divisions. It's not like everyone who's not part of the regime was always getting along and there's no infighting domestically. One would not describe that about Iran. But when it comes to this issue, given what you just said, these factions are on the same path.
Absolutely. Now, I'm not going to go over what you said about, the ethnicities in Iran being divided. I think if I were to qualify what you just said, I would say that this regime has spent the last 44 years investing in every possible way to survive. And one of those strategies to assure its own survival has been to create divisions. So I don't think that Iran's ethnicities are inherently against each other or divided, based on some beef from the past. But I think the regime has constantly invested in the idea of creating this fear that if we go away, the country will fall apart because these ethnic minorities will start to go at each other. So what has been incredibly moving to me, I'm not even talking about, people who aren't paying attention to Iran. I'm saying what has stunned me is the fact that all these minorities, all these ethnic groups that we heard for years and years who were at each other's throats are united in a way that, again, I haven't seen since 1978.
1978, wow.
So, people say, what are the signs of the revolution? First sign, kids are ripping up the images of the leadership out of their textbooks. Sign number two, the entire country, all the ethnicities have come together. And, the Azeris are chanting on behalf of the Kurds. The Kurds are chanting on behalf of the Baluchis. And it's really an amazingly beautiful thing, even though the circumstances are entirely tragic.
Thank you for reporting that, because I don't think that's widely known. So that's important.
Yeah.
I have an anecdote for you. It's an entertaining anecdote, but it's also a depressing one. Years ago, during the Green Revolution, that year in 2009, or the Green Movement. And this was the period of time where the students were challenging the election results, which is what you intimated a moment ago. Thought their vote didn't count and that Ahmadinejad had been elected again. So I received an email from an Iranian student in Tehran who said, I know you have something called FOLCS, and Alec Baldwin is your, I couldn't believe this. He said, Alec Baldwin is going to be one of your next guests. We also know that Alec Baldwin is going to be hosting the Oscars in April. And I'm going to ask you, would you do me a favor? Would you ask him to wear a green ribbon that night? And so that we could all watch, that message would be sent, because essentially, the mythology is that 1 billion people watch the Oscars. I don't think it's true, but people think 1 billion people watch Oscars. So the student asked me, so I immediately called up Alec, who was going to be a guest, and Alec was intrigued by it. It turned out that the producers of the Oscars wouldn't let him. He was worried about it. And of course, that movement was squashed pretty quickly.
Yeah.
We also know that in 2019, another revolution movement, what was it, Bloody November, was squashed pretty quickly. Now we're in a month and a half. This is different. This is, in your mind, this is a revolution with legs. This revolution will reach some completion because we've been baited by the courage of Iranians, and we've in my mind abandoned them, because I thought what President Obama did with the Green Movement was outrageous, just outrageous. How we just, he was so flirtatious with the Ayatollahs. He was always, I would sit down with them without preconditions. So he was always, I think now he recently said he regretted that he didn't act. But I remembered thinking, this student reached out to me. I thought, my God, I'm in the center of this. How did that happen? All because of the Oscars, right? So I feel like we've abandoned the Iranians. Is this going to fulfill the aspirations of freedom of choice? And will it happen because the rest of the world won't abandon Iran?
Mm-hmm. So in my assessment, this is a revolution. I think in anybody who looks at it fairly, it's a revolution because it meets the circumstances of a revolution. The regime can't appease the people, and the people will not relent and given surrender to the regime under any circumstances. So they're at a standstill facing each other. And this population, these protesters, have done things that, again, we've gone over this. I haven't seen the nation do since 19.
No, you've made this point.
And,
this is right.
And the most amazing thing is the absence of an ideological agenda. Now, what I find really interesting is that people point to this and say, look, they're not driven by an ideology. Why is that a weakness? That's the strength of this movement, because it doesn't want ideology. It doesn't want religion. It doesn't want communism. It doesn't want, it wants the very fundamental principles that guide a democracy.
Do you think that the same argument could be made about that it doesn't seem to have a leader that everyone is galvanizing, mobilizing around, that even that is not necessary for this movement?
Well, first of all, there are leaders that people in Iran know about, but outside
you know
of Iran,
about them, and you know them.
So,
right.
So that's part of it, and there are at least a couple of people whom I have been following for a few years who were picked up within the first 2 days of the uprisings. However,
wait, can you explain that? Because the regime believed they would be particularly dangerous if they were
particularly dangerous even before the protests started. I mean, one of them is named Hossein Ronaqi, and Hossein Ronaqi was publishing op-eds in the Wall Street Journal against the regime for the past 2 years. It was an incredible thing. I would pick up the journal and I would say, how is it possible that this guy is publishing this stuff in the Wall Street Journal? So he has been outspoken. He's incredibly articulate. There is another fellow named Majid Tabakkoli, equally staggeringly thoughtful, interesting, charismatic. So there are women, there are men who are in prison. We don't know about them. But another argument that I want to make here is that what do we have in the 21st century that works like the stuff we had in the 20th century? Our phones don't work the same way. We don't go to school in the same way. We don't go to work in the same way. Why do we think that people around the world are going to conduct revolutions in the same way? So I think we just have to accept the fact that all the business models for everything as we had known it have fallen apart. And we have to accept that there are ways in which things work that they never did before. For instance, one of the most effective means at the hands of the protesters thus far has been all the digital hacking that has been going on.
Yeah.
They hack. The evening news was being broadcast on the Channel 1, the government's official television broadcast, and all of a sudden they hacked into it, and it was the image of the supreme leader in the fires of hell on flame, saying, Mahsa Amini, Mahsa Amini, Mahsa Amini, and they had to cut to commercial. So we can't expect to see things, any event unfold in the way that they unfolded in the past.
Roya, that's a really terrific original idea. Really, thank you for sharing that. Really terrific. So I wrote an essay for the 3rd anniversary for the Wall Street Journal for the 3rd anniversary of Arab Spring. And it was a mocking essay because I said, happy birthday, happy anniversary, Arab Spring. And then I went through the countries and I said, oh my God, no democracy anywhere. 3 years in, only Tunisia, and then that's done, right? So it was a romantic period of the Arab Spring. I remember this, it was like Prague Spring, right? Like next, and yet it resulted in nothing. And one of the things I said in the essay was, could it possibly be that region of the world simply democracy won't take? And so I can't help but ask you this question to say, does it even make a difference, right? Because unfortunately, the Iranians, the PR in the during the Islamic era, if you ask a lot of people, they say, oh, you mean the people that burn American flags and say death to America, death to Israel, death to Danish cartoonists, death to French cartoonists, death to British novelists, death to the Pope. Death to the Pope? What's wrong with you, Pete? Death to the Pope? So I would say Americans are used to those images of the Iranians. So did we not see the right Iran? Because I want to believe that what those images is not Iran. And what we're seeing in the revolution today is Iran. It's the Iran of your childhood, the people that you remember. Can you clarify this for us?
The first reason I decided to write my memoir, which came out in 2005, so we're talking about almost 20 years ago, was because I was in conversation with a New York Times editorialist who used to tell me, this Iran that you talk about isn't the Iran that the New York Times that I write for knows about. And in fact, after several conversations, and that's the first chapter of the book, he was the one who said, you have to write about your Iran. And that's how my memoir came about. Because up until then, I was writing in Persian exclusively. I had no intention of writing.
Well, this is why I'm asking you, because I was struck by your memoir, because I was not used, and then I met you. I was struck by, this is not, I don't see images of this Iran. I see hostage takers and burning Uncle Sam in effigy.
Right. So I think the reason that's the only Iran we heard about in the West and in America was because there was already a proclivity to say that we never understood that region. We're never going to understand that region. And we were so ripe to turn a single error, which was, misread some aspects of Iran's events under the Shah into a colossal error on all parts in every direction on behalf of America.
And where you're talking about the State Department, academia, nobody was reading anything right. Everyone misjudged.
No. I'm not saying that everybody was misreading. I'm saying that everybody was assuming that they were reading it correctly.
I see.
And when they realized that there were aspects of it that they misread, they were so offended that there was an error that they had committed that they continued, expanded to this gargantuan proportions that it now had to include everything. So I think, the rise I shouldn't say, there was a rise of Islamism, which began in Iran in 1979 in a way that we had never seen. But that surprised them to the degree, and I mean the academia, I mean the administration, I mean, liberal intellectuals and, in the West and in the United States, so that rather than say, maybe there were aspects of it that we misunderstood, they said, we never understood it, we can never understand it. And this is who these people are, because we never saw that this was a possibility. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I know exactly.
Just because they had missed the idea that's, by the way, present in this country, right? I mean, we have super conservative Americans who believe that Donald Trump has been sent by God. So we have the counterpart to this sort of population in Iran, and those were the Khomeinyists in 1978 and 1979. So just because they weren't seeing this phenomenon, they assumed that the people that they had been unable to recognize existing in Iran must be the representatives of the entire Iran.
So would we extrapolate and say that Israelis don't realize that most Iranians do not think that Israel should be wiped off the map? Because again, here are the images that the world sees, right? You have presidents and ayatollahs that use this language, this eliminationist language that no other country. So you can understand why there's some people like your friend Thane who thinks these are barbarians. These, I don't know what the Iranians are, but this sounds like barbarians.
Right.
Every time all they want to talk about is wiping the people off the earth.
Right. So you shouldn't trust what I say. You should go to a survey that Anti-Defamation League conducted 10 years ago of the Middle East and North Africa region, measuring the degree of anti-Semitism in those countries. And Iran came at the bottom of that list.
Wow.
Compared to all the other countries in that region, Iran was the least anti-Semitic nation in that entire region, which surprised the ADL.
I'm sure.
Right? And then that's 12 years ago. And what I'm saying is that Iran has become even less anti-Semitic since then. And the reason isn't that somebody is educating the population. The reason is that the population is so distrustful of the regime that everything that the regime is for, they're against, and everything that the regime is against, they're for.
I was wondering whether you would say something else there, which is, as you were talking earlier, I thought, I'm older than you. And so I remember the Shah. And my memory of the Iran in the 70s was what you just said before. It was secular, that you had religious Muslims, but they were listening to the Beatles. This was not like, this was, to me, the men wore Western suits, right? If you asked me as a teenager, I would say if there was one place I should go visit, is Tehran. I would like it. I would enjoy it there, right? I mean, I think I was so shocked with the hostage taking because it completely, like, what just happened to Iran? I thought you were going to say, Thane, my childhood memories are genuine. This is an intellectual country. There was a cultural elite here. These people read books. When you talk about, what is it, 50, 60% of Egyptian women can't read. They're illiterate. You said, this is not Iran. People go to universities. This is a whole different, the revolution has tainted the image of what Iranians are. But, we are the great Persians, for God's sakes. We gave the Greeks a run for their money. Don't forget who we are. And I think that we have forgotten who we are. I was hoping that you would sort of make this point.
As you said, exactly. but I also want to add that the image that came to the West, or the West took away about Iran and Iranians after 1979, paired with the proclivity of Western liberals towards self-flagellation, a deep desire to think that everything good that happened was someone else's responsibility, but everything bad that happened was the responsibility of some American misunderstanding or misdoing. And
I'm sorry, this goes to the core of being opposed to American exceptionalism, being, associating America with colonialism. You're saying it's all in that camp that we hear more and more of.
Actually, I think it's the flip side of colonialism, in that when we were colonialists and proud of it, we thought that nothing good happens in the world except if we do it, or if we're leading it. But now we think, or at least vis-a-vis Iran, we think that nothing bad can possibly happen in Iran unless we're leading it, right? So I think the misrepresentation of Iran as a result of the revolution could not have had the same effect had it not been this vast elite within the academia, within the United States, who said, oh, you see all the crazy things they're doing? It's not their fault, it's our fault.
We screwed them up.
We screwed them up. And so then, a whole bunch of narratives started to circulate, not once, not twice, for years. And part of what I have been really stunned by is that it doesn't matter how much new material that gets out there. These narratives are very difficult to undo. And one of them is that, Iran was a perfect democracy, and then 1953,
Right.
America, conducted a coup. America didn't single-handedly conduct a coup. America participated in a coup. And they overthrew the government of Mossadegh, and there you are,
Well, also I remember, again, this goes back to when I was in college, the idea that America would accept the Shah for cancer treatment in the United States.
Yes.
As if that was like a coup, right? The idea that he could come to MD Anderson or wherever he went for cancer treatment, that was another, blight that
Right.
America did, that it was an unforgivable sin.
Right, exactly. And then, I was part of a group of, documentary filmmakers, and I had to actually walk away from the team because we couldn't see eye to eye about, the history that we were trying to narrate in this episode. But they, what they were saying was that only because the United States decided to take the Shah for treatment, the students of the Imam line, the hostage takers, scaled the walls of the embassy and took over, which again meant that they were some innocent kids who would not have done it if we had not taken the Shah, forgetting that on February 14 of 1979, they had taken the US embassy for a day, but it was negotiated and they were forced to get out. So on November 9th, 1979, when they scaled the walls and took it over, it was the second time. Right. So you can't tell me that they took over the American embassy because these innocent people wouldn't have done it if we hadn't taken the Shah, because they were already doing it in the past and they had already done it. So it's these narratives that paired with the images that were coming, that certain elements within the United States and very much within the academia were invested in circulating, that we're stuck with.
So this is going to be a tough question, I think, for you.
Are you sure?
Yeah, I think it is, but you'll do fine. I forgot to tell everyone you were also a producer at 60 Minutes, so you're a real pro. You've testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
Yeah. You
have spoken directly to Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. Do our government leaders understand what's going on? Are they buying anything you're saying? Are they hearing misinformation? We always hear the words misinformation. I worry because I see guys like Blinken. I mean, you're way more diplomatic than me. If I was in the room, I would talk to Blinken about the original Iran deal and how insane were you at that time? What were you smoking, Mr. Blinken? So, but of course you wouldn't say that, but I would say that. But I'm saying that I look at them and I say, well, that's like the Iran deal too. The same team is back in the Biden administration. So I worry that they really just don't know what they're looking at when they look at Iran. And when they hear you, I worry that they say, yeah, she's really smart and interesting, but we have to reject her advice.
Well, I don't know what's going on in their heads, but I can tell you that we met at the State Department with, Blinken and all the top brass involved in Iran work. And we were 5 women, and at least 4 of us said, beyond any reasonable doubt, that what was going on in Iran was a revolution, and that if they're unable to entirely abandon the negotiations with Iran over the nuclear agreement, they should at least pause it until the regime ceased the violence on the streets against the protesters, right? I mean,
by the way, can you just explain what is the posture right now? Because I would think it's de facto on hiatus because the regime is busy dealing with hundreds of thousands of protesters and are not in. I don't know whether they're saying, and let's go get that Iran deal. I'm assuming for the same reason I look at the region generally, and I think the region is probably in much better shape in Lebanon and Syria and in Yemen and in Gaza and in Lebanon because they're busy with the protesters. So I'm saying, in the minds of the mullahs, do they have Iran deal on their mind to free up billions of dollars?
I am sure some, because it involves millions of dollars, there are some of them who are interested in doing this, but I don't think the regime has the bandwidth. But I think Iran's grave error of the past month, even gravest than what it's doing to protesters on the streets of Iran, is to have gotten involved in the war against Ukraine. And that really changes all the calculation on the part of the United States and Europe. So I think if it's on ice at the moment, it's far more because of the participation in the with Russia.
So then you would say, I think you would say, that there's two phases to the Ukraine influence, right? On the one hand, there is the emotional solidarity that even the rest of the world would connect the Iranian and the Ukrainian people together, and the stalwart bravery and the courage and the sacrifice. And you would also say that Iran made this other mistake, that they joined up in that struggle. And so that they're on the evil Axis side. Yes. And so that was a tactical error, because that the people have yet another reason. If you're living in Italy, you have another reason to hate the Iranian regime. They're on the side of Putin, right?
Right. So you and I are calling it tactical error, but I think they're seeing it as the only way to survive. And had it not paid off in Syria, they might not have done it again. They probably wouldn't have done it again. But the problem is that it paid off in Syria.
That's such a great point, right? I mean, right? You maybe briefly explain what you mean.
Well, the Syrians had a major revolution. It was they took to the streets. It was for 2-3 weeks, maybe 4. I don't remember exactly the period. It was a peaceful protest movement against Bashar Assad, and then everything fell apart the moment that Iran decided that it was going to prop up Assad at any price.
And Russia was their pal.
And Russia was their pal. And together, they banded together to keep Assad up. And everything that Russia ended up doing in Bucha, and doing it so cruelly well, was because they already had done it in Syria. They had done it in, to various cities in Syria. So they just had a playbook that they were reading off of, and they were repeating. So you and I say that Iran made a tactical mistake. Iran is thinking, this is not a tactical mistake. We did that together successfully, so we're going to do this together successfully. So they're either going to sink or swim together. And by God, I hope that it's going to be sink.
And they must have also said, despite all of the talk of Assad gassing his own people, in the end, Obama drew one line, then he moved the line. There was no real humanitarian intervention. There were some coalition forces, but not really. And so they're thinking, what's the risk? What's the consequence? Syria is a very good example. And we got away with it. And they're our pal. Why would we not just join up with our pal again? And the world won't care. And by the way, for people who are opposed to the original Iran deal, they would use that as yet another example, that in the end, they negotiate with us. They're afraid of us. In the end, they're going to lift the sanctions. In the end, they're going to do deals with us. We don't have to really modify our behavior. We will enrich uranium no matter where we are. We'll put it in the mountains. And nothing's going to happen. No one is going to push back. I think what's happened, what you're just thinking, what you're saying is that I think Putin is surprised with what happened with Ukraine, and the clerics are shocked what's happening on the streets.
Precisely. And I think now that we're kind of seeing this regional connection and non-regional connection, because now we see that, Ukraine is not in the Middle East, but it's actually a very important player in the faith of Iranians in near future. because if Ukrainians win and Putin is weakened, a lot can change about the regime in Tehran. So this brings me to a really important point here, that if we realize as a global community that we need to fight COVID together in order to contain it and defeat it, if we understand as a global community that in order to change climate change, or in order to undo some of the effects of climate change, we need to work together as a global community. Why in the world do we not see that we need to work together as a global community to prop up democracy, to save democracy from evil actors like Putin and Khamenei?
Well, here's what I want to say, ask you about this. I hear that, and I go back to what I said about Arab Spring, because I hear that and go, I'm talking to my buddy, Roya Hakakian. She is, everything about her. She's intellectual. She's highly educated. She understands what democracies mean. She's a feminist, right? And I'm thinking, does she actually think that we could prop up democracies in Iran? In other words, is it possible that we could topple the regime and that the women who have sacrificed for this movement and are fighting for freedom and choice, in the end, won't get freedom of choice? They might just get another look to another dictatorship, not theocratic, but maybe something else. Is that, I'm saying, I hate to sound so cynical, but I look at that side of the world, and I think, what's next for Iran? What's possible?
Okay, so I don't want to comment on Arab Spring. It will take us away from this conversation. I don't want to talk about why that failed. But I'm going to tell you something that I think changes, I hope, our conversation about Iran, which is that this event, which we're calling a revolution in Iran, has a 110-year history. Iran began its quest for constitutionalism in the early 20th century. And it was a face-off between the secular population of Iran, who wanted a European-style constitution, and the clerical Iran that didn't want for the influence of the clergy to not be actually written into the law, into the constitution. So in every possible way, you can look at this history and say, this movement has reached maturity in a way that all other movements, including, by the way, the American Revolution, which began in 1776, but it didn't really become what it was meant to become up until the Civil War. We too, as Iranians, have been on a same trajectory to move from what, the revolution that began, the constitutional revolution that began in the earlier 20th century, to come to this moment, which I call the absolute moment of the maturity of a movement that has been in the works for over 100 years. Now, can we say that the same thing has been working within, Tunisia and Egypt and all the other nations in Arab world that, try to bring about a revolution? I don't know. That's a different conversation. But I think in Iran, there is this trajectory that the nation has been on, and this is the point of full maturity. And that's why I think, whether we want it or not as Americans, they are doing the overthrowing of the regime. We don't have to do it. They don't want us to do it because they're doing it. All we have to do is provide the sort of support that we decided we ought to provide to Ukraine. It's not weapons. They don't want a war. They're not asking for military support, but they're asking for every other support possible in order for the democratic forces in Iran to win.
I know that so much of the movement is dependent on social media and the internet. And we also know that the regime often turns off the internet.
Yes.
So is that an area that I don't even know, I'm not a techie. Is that an area where the United States can be helpful?
Sure. I mean, it's hugely important. I mean, it's like turning off a water faucet. You know, when they don't want it, you have nothing. And so that's really important. I think there are many ways.
You're saying that's not weapons, but that's huge, right?
That's huge. That's
right.
Huge for, you know, and another thing that's huge is that there are all sorts of companies in Europe and elsewhere that are providing surveillance strategy and equipment and all sorts of things to the regime to track down the protesters, you know, via their cell phones and other digital equipment. Let's crack down on them too. So there is a lot we can do. We don't have to worry that they're asking us to do military intervention. They're not. We don't have to worry that they're asking us to overthrow. No, they're doing it. There are people who are actually empty-handed, walking right up to the riot police that has, you know, that is fully armed. They're asking us to do everything else possible to support them. And for the love of God, why is that not absolutely vital for the health of our own democracy and democracy everywhere?
Let's take some questions from the audience. That was a wonderful answer, Roya. This comes from Leila Hekmati, and she asks, and this is, in a way, picks up from what you just said, because she's, I think, asking, what are the concrete steps we can take here in the West? And I think she's referring to individuals, not necessarily government, because she then goes on to say, to support the people of Iran. For instance, I try to go to every protest. I sign any petition, but I still feel so helpless. Mm-hmm. So here's a question, not for the Secretary of State, but for Leila Hekmati. What kinds of things can individuals do?
You know, I have to say, tune into social media, because everybody comes up with all sorts of really interesting things. Like 2 days ago, I saw a post by a young Iranian saying that from this moment forward, especially during the period of the elections, I'm going to conduct a sit-in in front of the US Capitol, nonstop. So, you know, people are doing all sorts of interesting things. But thankfully, you are old enough to remember, but during the hostage crisis, I was in Iran in 1979 and 1980. But, you know, when I came here, I realized that, learned that Americans had put on a yellow ribbon, you know, around their trees and, you know, on display publicly to signal to each other that they were keeping the hostages in their minds. You know, let's come up with, you know, some sort of flag, some kind of purple ribbon or something, just to show, remind ourselves and also provide moral support for Iranians that we're thinking about them. And by the way, you know, when was the last time that our feminists and our little girls had other women to look up to in a way that we look up to these women for the courage they're showing?
This drives me nuts, so don't get me started here.
I know. I mean, look.
Drives me nuts.
We have to do this. We need to support them, but not just because of them, because of us, because we have forgotten what it means to be a human community. Exactly. We have forgotten what it means to stand by fundamentally important human principles that can change not just their lives, but our own, because we have fallen out of touch with them.
But I'm going to get to another question, but I wonder, when I hear you and I think, well, how many of those people over the last 3 years are just terrified to be thought of as an Islamophobe, right? Like that they could actually end up being, the feminists should be saying, I stand with the women of Iran. I stand with the women of Iran. But, you know, one of our guests, we had Ayaan Hirsi Ali years ago, and we needed bomb-sniffing dogs. It took us 20 minutes to get it started. She received a 20-minute standing ovation. This is a woman who's standing up for the women of Islam, but she's an Islamophobe because she's standing up for the women of Islam. So I'm wondering, is that another reason why feminists, because it just drives me nuts. I would think feminists in the United States would be banging on the desks on cars on behalf of the women in Islamic societies, banging away. And instead, I think they're worried about being called an Islamophobe. Here's a question that fits to something you just said before, when you talked about what they're asking. This person, Randy Waltuck Barnett, says, how violent will this revolution become if when it takes hold? Now, you said it's already a revolution. While the pen is or may be mightier than the sword, will the current leaders really succumb without a fight? The reason this question is important is because we got used to the mighty Ukrainians who were willing to just sacrifice limb every day. And is that what we should be expecting? Is it possible that the Ayatollahs could act in the same way as Putin? Is it possible that the Iranian women will start, arming themselves? What is it that what are we going to look at here?
Well, I hope the Iranian people won't arm themselves, because that will shift this movement into, God forbid, what Syria became. Right. The difference between Iran now and what Syria became is simply one thing: weapons. And once Iranians become armed, this goes from a peaceful revolution and goes into the territory of civil war. And then the international community will wash its hands off of it because it becomes a civil war. So it's the worst thing that could happen. But we have heard from the protesters over and over again that they're not going home. And because they're not going home, and because I think Iran at the moment is an extension of Ukraine in terms of their democratic plight, we need to do whatever we can to support them. And what else is there to do?
Right. Other than that.
Yes.
Right. I mean, there should be nothing else for us to do. Roya, I must tell you, you have such an important voice, and I am so proud to be your friend, especially at this time in world history. And, I'm sorry, I hate to use the cliche, go girl. I mean, seriously, this is a woman's movement. And I think how fortunate Iran has, in my mind, that they not only have these extraordinary women who have had enough and are taking the lead, and then there are extraordinary women here in the United States. And I'm pointing to my friend Roya in particular, who is an articulate champion, an articulate voice, and a way to explain this part of the world, because I think we did a good job tonight to actually clarify what we're really looking at when we've been looking at Iran for 40 years. Like, what have we been looking at? And I think that you did a really good job of that, because I push that side because we haven't seen a human face. Mm-hmm. We don't see it. And I don't know if that's the media's fault. I don't know if it feels like somewhat of the United States. It's like, I think you made that point earlier. It's like we gave up on Iran. Mm-hmm. It's like we gave up. We said, we just can't deal with that. Whatever. They just burn stuff. But it's
now they're burning scarves.
But now they're burning, right? They're burning the right stuff. Yes. So before we say goodbye to you and thank you, and we send you off with Godspeed and good luck for fighting on behalf of your people and being this wonderful woman crusader, we've got a couple quick announcements, I think. Madeline, what do we got? Is this an upcoming event? Oh, we do have some upcoming events coming up, but I'm not sure we have the posters out on them. Yes, we're a nonprofit. We haven't charged during the pandemic. And so as we come to the end of the year, your year-end gifts, maybe you can keep FOLCS in your mind. What we did tonight with Roya, in my mind, is the perfect example what FOLCS can do. We make ideas important and make movements, understandable, comprehensive, enough so that it inspires you to join. You heard what Roya said at the end. what is there left for us to do but to act? Roya, thank you again.
Thank you.
Please join us again on another FOLCS event. And for FOLCS, I'm Thane Rosenbaum. Good night.
Thank you.